Good evening. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for braving the rain this evening and the dreariness to come to the space. My name is Shelley Woodruff, and I have the privilege of being one of the pastors here at First Baptist, and I want to welcome you first to a Conversations event. A quick note of comfort, we do have restrooms in the back down the stairs for men and women, but in this hallway behind me, we do have accessible restrooms as well as non-gendered restrooms if you need to, find those during the event. And we also do have A Capella Books who are selling books in the back. They will be open after the event if you still want to purchase a book, and not only to have the book in your hand, but also to support one of our many amazing local booksellers who really are the backbone of free speech. I'm glad we agree on something. And I want to say that it really is a privilege to get to host these events because it's a gift to partner yet again with Georgia Center for the Book. Because together we get to bring conversations that matter to our community, conversations that we hope will illuminate and challenge and also break down barriers between each other and also within ourselves. And the second reason why it is a privilege to host these Conversations events is because we are in a sanctuary. And a sanctuary is supposed to be a safe space where truth can stand in the light. And unfortunately, all too often, sanctuaries tend to look away from the truth because the truth is rarely convenient and it is really hard to bend to personal agendas. So the fact that this evening we can have investigative journalism, which is a gateway to our access to truth, be able to be illuminated here in this space for an hour, it is a gift. It's a gift to host that in this space. And we hope that together, our exploration of truth, our experience of the truth will all help us not only to learn more, to challenge ourselves, and then to be empowered to pursue it ourselves. I would like to introduce Joe Davidge with Georgia Center for the Book, and we will continue with our evening.
Thank you so much, Shelley. First Baptist makes my job so much easier in so many ways. They have a great staff here with Deborah and all of the guys who are working at the sound booth and their volunteers. We've been doing these events over here for about 16 years now. And every once in a while, we have problems over at our library in Decatur. We clearly wouldn't have space in our auditorium for you all, and that would have been a shame. And it's funny that Shelley mentioned restrooms because, of course, we're having restroom renovations done at our building. So, yeah, that would have been a problem too. But they've always been welcoming and do such a fantastic job working with us. And, we're already looking even into August for events. So a big round of applause for First Baptist Church and all the wonderful volunteers here. And as Shelley mentions, A Capella is here with us tonight. All the books have been signed. The authors just hammered out signature after signature, and they do not have carpal tunnel yet, which is a good thing because after the event, if you would like those copies personalized to yourself or to someone as a gift, maybe someone who needs convincing of things, that this would be a good opportunity to do that because they can't return it when it's signed to them. It's bookseller 101. Anyway, we are so very pleased to have this event, like Shelley said. Find Me the Votes, of course, is 2 years of immersive journalism. And as I was joking earlier, I love books that have a cast of characters. It is like a Shakespearean play, and it reminds me of that Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. It's been very interesting since about 2020. And it may continue to be interesting into the future. Things have ramifications. The ripples keep going outward. But we have 3 fantastic journalists here to discuss this with you tonight. First, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Greg Bluestein. He's a political reporter who covers state politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He also contributes to the Political Insider blog and the Jolt newsletter. He hosts the Politically Georgia podcast, co-hosts shows on WSB and Georgia Public Broadcasting outlets, and is a frequent guest on local and national TV and radio programs. He is the author of Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly of Republican Power. And you may remember that we named that as a book all Georgians should read. So you may need to read it, just in case you haven't. And he will be interviewing our two authors this evening. Michael Isikoff is an award-winning Washington investigative journalist and the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Uncovering Clinton, A Reporter's Story, Hubris, The Inside Story of Spin, Scandal, and the Selling of the Iraq War, and Russian Roulette, The Inside Story of Putin's War on America and the Election of Donald Trump. That sounds like a twofer on your bookshelf with this one, just saying. He's worked for the Washington Post, Newsweek, NBC News, and is a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, and other networks. Daniel Klaidman is an award-winning journalist and author based in Brooklyn. He spent more than a decade at Newsweek, where he served as a managing editor, Washington bureau chief, Middle East correspondent, and investigative reporter. Klaidman was a key part of the teams that won the National Magazine Awards for Newsweek's coverage of 9/11 and the Monica Lewinsky affair. He previously served as the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University and is the author of Kill or Capture: The War on Terror and the Soul of the Obama Presidency. So will you please join me to welcome Michael Isikoff, Daniel Klaidman, and Greg Bluestein.
These are very comfy chairs. Well, I'm going to ask about 30 or so minutes of questions, and then we'll open up the audience. I'll give you guys a heads up before I do. But just to start it off, by the way, there's a minor, not an error, but just a clarification in the introduction of Mr. Isikoff. It's now 4 New York Times bestsellers because this book is now officially a New York Times bestseller. So.
Yeah, we need to stay on the list.
So we were just around the corner at a coffee shop when Daniel and I both got calls from our editors within about a minute of each other with the news that Donald Trump is likely coming here on Thursday for that big hearing involving Fani Willis. And it reminded me of the challenge that you guys both faced in writing a book that was still evolving. We still don't know the end of the story. So to start us off, tell us about how you decided to frame the story as a page-turning, gripping political narrative, but also a character study of Fani Willis.
Well, don't you have your own mic there? I think I saw 2 mics now.
You need mine.
Anyway, good question, Greg, because basically this started with the germ of an idea back in 2021 after the Trump-Raffensperger phone call was released, and as we report in the book, for Fani Willis, the very first question in her mind, while everybody was dissecting the words on the tape and cable TV was playing it over and over again, is where was Brad Raffensperger when he took that call? And because she wanted to know, was it in Fulton County? In fact, he was at home in Johns Creek, a affluent suburb, but just a couple of miles in the Fulton County line. And she knew instantly, this is one of my counties, this is on my turf. And, she said right off that she had an obligation to investigate what appeared to be, on its face, a prima facie case of at least potential election fraud or inducement for election fraud. And this is 2021. It's before Jack Smith is appointed. It didn't look like the Justice Department was going to really, although they were investigating January 6th, of course, there was not really an indication they were going to look at Trump's conduct itself. So we just came up with the idea, like, you know, there's got to be a great story here, and this could be quite the case, a local prosecutor taking on the President of the United States. Small problem, we had no sources in Georgia at all. I mean, you know, I'd been through the Atlanta airport a number of times. I think I'd been around, you know.
I'd never been to Georgia.
And he'd never been to
I've
Georgia.
now been here 20 times, and I'm thinking about moving to Atlanta.
There you go. So just to, like, you know, wrap this up, we spent a lot of time in just old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, knocking on doors, going to see people, setting up appointments, and just spending face-to-face time. And over time, it paid off because we got a lot of people to talk who hadn't talked before or hadn't said very much before, and it ultimately led to this book.
I will say, we did have one thing before we started this reporting project. We had one really important document. It was a book called Flipped by our moderator, and it actually really was very important for us because it was such a tremendous guide to the political, chicanery that was happening after the 2020 election, and to all of the players and personalities. But that's kind of where we started. And one thing that we did not have, like I said, we didn't have any sources. Well, we didn't have any sources who were close to the investigation. The investigation had really just started. If you are reporting on a major political legal case in real time, that can be challenging because prosecutors don't want to share the things that they're learning. They can't share evidence. And so we did have to figure out how to get inside the investigation, how to develop relationships. And we knew from pretty early on that Fani Willis was going to be a very significant character in the book. We got a sense of her personality. We got a sense of this. The phrase that kept coming up over and over again was that Fani Willis was a force of nature. And that is true on many levels. Just her sheer, the force of her personality, but it was also the case in courtrooms in Fulton County, where she was the star litigator, the DA and others would have young assistant DAs go watch her in trial because she was that good. We were able to spend, quite a lot of time with her over the course of the 2 years that we reported on this book. I think we had about half a dozen interviews, and talked to a lot of people who worked with her, who knew her well, her friends, her father, who was an extraordinary figure, and the most important person in her life, a former Black Panther and then criminal defense lawyer in Washington who organized voters in the South, but then became, as I said, a Black Panther. What we ended up with, I think, is a pretty nuanced portrait of a very complicated and very human person. Since the controversy has erupted about the relationship with Nathan Wade, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. I think that the book provides a lot of kind of context for, the question is, how would she do something like this? People have asked, how would she allow herself to, jeopardize this investigation? And I think the answer is that she is incredibly talented and an amazing lawyer, but she's human. And sometimes these sort of larger-than-life characters have flaws that seem as large as their strengths. And her strengths are prodigious. but she's real, and she's fascinating. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the Fani Willis stories.
Yeah, we have quite a few, but I just was thinking of one that's in the book, which we haven't talked about before, but it's like right after the Raffensperger phone call, becomes public, and she indicates she's obligated to do an investigation of a potential crime that took place in her jurisdiction. She goes on the Rachel Maddow show. It's the one interview she had done, national interview she had done at that point. And Rachel Maddow asks her about if she's going to do depositions of the witnesses. And Fani Willis then lectures Rachel Maddow. I'm sorry, but that depositions are in civil lawsuits. We're criminal prosecutors, and we don't do depositions. We subpoena witnesses and haul them before grand juries. And I just love the fact that here's this, local DA lecturing, the brainy Rhodes Scholar Rachel Maddow about the basics of criminal law.
Yeah. She's impolitic. Sometimes she's incredibly confident, and she has that quality that a lot of the great trial lawyers have, which is a certain bravado, a certain certitude that can get you in trouble a little bit. I mean, it borders on arrogance sometimes, but those qualities can be hugely valuable when you're running for office or when you're trying a murder case, but they can also be blinding in some instances.
Daniel, let's talk about that bravado for a second, because there was a story in this book that I had never heard before. And I really learned, I've written a lot about her, I've read a lot about her, but really this book gave me an insight of what makes Fani Willis tick. And there's a story you guys told that really speaks to the bravado when T.I. sat down with Fani Willis in the middle of a very, very heated, very uphill battle election campaign against the incumbent district attorney, who everyone in this room knows, Paul Howard, and T.I. made a demand of her. Can you guys talk about that?
Yeah, I think it reveals quite a bit about her and the politics of the DA's race. This is the summer of George Floyd, and Fani Willis was running on a tough-on-crime platform against Paul Howard. She is not the progressive prosecutor that liberals want her to be. She didn't get a dime of George Soros's money, even though they came to vet her. When they did, they walked out. The vetter, we have this story in the book, walked out because she wasn't saying anything that the George Soros people wanted to hear. So summer of 2020, and it was quite hairy here in Atlanta. One case that looms large, we have a whole chapter in the book about the Sequoia Turner murder, this young 8-year-old African-American girl who's being driven by her mother and her mother's boyfriend through an area where protesters had set up an autonomous zone after a guy named Rayshard Brooks had been shot by the police. And this looked to some at the time like another case of George Floyd. There were a lot of differences, which you can read about in the book. And it turned out that there were no charges ever filed against the cops because they had a reasonable basis to do what they did, according to the prosecutors. But anyway, Fani Willis is endorsed by the police union, and she's endorsed by Mary Norwood, a Buckhead Republican anti-crime activist. T.I., the Grammy Award-winning rap guy who's become a political power broker in Atlanta, comes to see Fani Willis during the campaign and said, "You renounce the endorsements of the police union and Mary Norwood and give back their contributions, and I'll make you whole. I'll cover whatever. In fact, you'll do better in terms of money." And Fani Willis says, "No. They're a member of my community just as you're a member of my community, and I'm not going to renounce the support of any members of the community." And T.I. is pissed off and gets up and walks out But that tells you a little bit about who Fani Willis is. And like I say, she's not the progressive prosecutor like we saw in San Francisco and Philadelphia and a lot of other big cities.
When we asked Fani Willis about that story, she said, well, that spoke to a little machismo. T.I. did not like a strong woman speaking up to him the way that she did.
And I think basically she doesn't like anybody telling her what she should do.
Well, you mentioned Nathan Wade earlier, right? And there's an enormously political, important political moment coming up on Thursday, a legal moment, I should say, with the hearing. Was there anything in your research, was there anything in your reporting of the book that gave you pause about the relationship or potential relationship between?
Nothing that suggested to us that there was a romantic relationship between Nathan Wade and Fani Willis. And in fact, since that's become public, I've spoken to people. We've spoken to people very close to Fani Willis. Nobody in her office, nobody on the prosecution team had any idea about it. They were shocked when they learned, based on all of the reporting we've done. You know, we did ask questions about Nathan Wade. It was. He was hired to be the lead prosecutor in the case, and we knew about his background. We knew that he had not done any RICO cases. Not many people have. Fani Willis has, of course. We knew that he had not, done a lot of complex felony cases, and his practice had largely been family and civil disputes. He also served as a judge, municipal judge in Cobb County. But it was a little surprising to see him in that role. But as we reported on the case and on the team, what we learned was that Nathan Wade, he was never anticipated to really be the lead trial lawyer or the legal architect of the case. He was hired to be much more of a behind-the-scenes player. And we've sat in the courtroom and watched these proceedings, and he generally defers to other lawyers. He was the guy who organized the case. It's very complex. Investigation involving eventually 19 co-defendants and a lot of lawyers, and you need someone to manage all that. You need someone to manage the egos of the other lawyers on the team, and he did that deftly. He also ran the grand jury process, which was very important, obviously, and we spoke to people inside the grand jury room, to grand jurors, including the one lawyer who was a member of the special purpose grand jury. And they saw Nathan Wade over hundreds of hours leading them through this very complicated conspiracy case. Dozens of witnesses, if not hundreds of witnesses, thousands of documents, some complicated legal issues. And by all accounts, he did very well. They were impressed with the job that he did. So the important context to understand is when you put together a prosecution team, it takes all kinds of people with varied and different skills. And this is why I think when Fani Willis spoke at Big Bethel Church, you could see that real resentment that people were questioning her judgment about who to put on the team. She put him on the team because she knew what he was good at and she knew what she was needed. Now, one really important thing, important part of this story, which we uncovered and is in the book, is Nathan Wade was not Fani Willis's first choice.
Or second choice.
Or
right?
second choice, possibly not even third choice. We're not sure of that. She went to some real heavy hitters.
Well, say who the first choice was.
And the first choice was Roy Barnes, the last Democratic governor of Georgia, as you all know, but also a very talented lawyer and trial lawyer, a real heavy hitter. She also went to a very well-respected criminal defense lawyer and former federal prosecutor named Gabe Banks, who, by the way, was in today's hearing in front of Judge McAfee. Neither of them wanted to get involved in the case, and the reason they gave was because they knew that being involved in a case like this meant that they and their families would get a ton of threats. And of course, they were right about that, which we write about in the book. Roy Barnes said to us, would you want to be followed around for the rest of your life, by bodyguards? And so he declined. And in the end, she ended up with Nathan Wade.
And one of the most gripping scoops you guys have in this book involves those threats. Shortly after, and I'll let you tell it, but shortly after, I'll set it up. Shortly after Fani Willis announces the indictments against Donald Trump.
We were all there that
all there
night.
Yeah.
Waiting for hours for the indictment to come out. This is last August, and if you remember, there were a few extra witnesses she wanted to bring before the regular grand jury, and it was taking time. But anyway, it's a midnight press conference, and what we didn't know at the time, none of us, but we discovered in the course of reporting this book, is what happened after that press conference. She had been getting threats from the beginning, but they were ramping up, getting more specific, more creepy, more menacing. Just a couple days before, she gets a call on her personal cell phone from a digitally disguised voice, gravelly, digitally disguised voice of a guy, threatening to kill her, rape her, using the N-word, and then mentions her daughters. Gets their names right and where they live. And that spooked her and spooked a lot of people. And just before the indictment, the security people discover on a MAGA website an assassination threat. The best time to shoot her is when she leaves the building. So that's what she was dealing with when she was announcing that indictment. So after the indictment, we're all filing stories. She goes back to her office, takes off her business suit, black business suit and pearls, and puts on sweats and a baseball cap, and a body double from the office, somebody who resembles her, puts on the black business suit and the pearls, looking exactly like Fani Willis, over a Kevlar bulletproof vest, by the way. And the body double, surrounded by others who look like the deputies, drive out of the building. And Fani Willis is smuggled out the back and driven off to an undisclosed location at a hotel. I mean, it's just so astonishing. Can you imagine what a story it would be if we discovered that Jack Smith or Merrick Garland had to be smuggled out of their office after a press conference because of an assassination
With a
threat?
body double, yeah.
And by the way,
it's so, and maybe you're going to make this point, but this parallels the very sort of conduct that she was investigating the whole time. Ruby Freeman, Shay Moss, Ralph Jones. We talk about all of them in the book, but the people who were living with these threats. And that's what Fani Willis was investigating, and for doing that, she was getting those threats herself.
I want to switch to some of the other characters in a moment, but I do want to ask one more Fani Willis question. You can't really talk about her without talking about her father, who you mentioned earlier, John Floyd, who led a faction of the Black Panthers. You guys scored the most extensive interview with John Floyd that I've seen. How did he influence her outlook? Because one of the things I was so struck with was that when she said she wanted to be DA, this former member of Black Panther said, go for it.
That's an amazing part of the story. So first of all, when John Floyd eventually, kind of sheds his radicalism, he goes to law school and eventually gets a job as a administrative law judge in Washington, D.C., and then becomes a criminal defense lawyer in Washington. Fani, who's a little girl, 5, 6 years old, moves to Washington. The mother is out of the picture, and John Floyd raises Fani Willis on his own. And it's an extraordinarily close relationship. And Fani is going down to the courthouse with him, and she's actually, managing his documents and the evidence and all these crime pictures, which is a kind of a interesting thing for a little girl to be doing. And she decides, after spending time in this sort of gritty, colorful courthouse, she says she wants to be a judge. And he says to her, well, Fani, if you want to be a judge, you first have to become a lawyer. And then flash forward, she goes to Howard undergraduate, she goes to Emory Law School, where she's a star and she's winning moot court competitions. At that point, when she started to get serious about her career, she says she still wants to be a judge. Her dad says to her, well, Fani, if you want to be a judge, you should become a prosecutor first, because that's the most direct route to becoming a judge. Now, here is the ex-Black Panther, civil rights lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, telling his daughter that she should become a prosecutor. He loves her so much, he believes in her so much that he's willing to make that philosophical sacrifice for her.
Tell them who her father's girlfriend was back in his Black Panther days.
John Floyd, he was not just someone who flirted with black nationalism. I mean, he was the real deal. He was the founder of the L.A. Black Panthers Party, which was an offshoot of Huey Newton's and Bobby Seale's up in Oakland. But he was close to all of these characters, H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael. He knew King. He knew them all. And during that time, he lived in an apartment with Angela Davis. Who obviously was a firebrand and a radical and got into some legal trouble, but was eventually acquitted, I guess, of those charges.
And by the way, Angela Davis did confirm the relationship with John
we had an
Floyd
email
in
exchange.
an email exchange to us.
And she was.
So yeah, they lived together for like 6 months or so.
Another incredible scene you both painted in the book was that of right after the Georgia special election in 2020, the November election in 2020, where Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, the then senators, were locked in a runoff against John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Donald Trump Jr. came to town. Then Republican Chair David Schaefer was here in Georgia, and incredible pressure was put on them, in turn put on the two Republican senators to do anything it took to help Donald Trump.
This says so much about the political culture and how menacing the environment was here in Georgia. Right after the November election, Donald Jr. flies down to whip up the troops and demand that the Georgia Republican Party get behind his father's challenge to the election results. Brad Raffensperger and Gabe Sterling had already held a press conference saying, look, the numbers we're still counting, but it's not looking good for the president. We've seen no evidence of irregularities, and which obviously undercut the message that the Trump folks wanted out there. So Don Jr. threatens to tank the two Republican senators running in the runoff, saying his father will tank their chances unless everybody in Georgia gets behind the Stop the Steal election challenges to reverse the election results that Brad Raffensperger was counting. Right after that, and you'll see a quote from David Schaefer, the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party, saying we couldn't afford to let Donald Trump get mad at us. We had to keep him on the reservation. We had to keep him happy. So right after Donald Jr.'s threats at the Buckhead headquarters, Loeffler and Perdue put out this statement demanding that Raffensperger resign immediately, right? Just doing exactly what the Trump folks wanted. And it's that night that the threats to Raffensperger start, including the threats to his wife, Tricia Raffensperger. We talked to her. That very night, she gets on her personal cell phone threat after threat. They're all horrific. We quote from them in the book. They're sexualized. They're like too disgusting to even, read in a public setting like this, but you can read it in the book. And it just shows you just what people were dealing with, because, that was the start. And of course, the Proud Boys show up at the Raffensperger's home. The MAGA warriors start harassing and following around their daughter-in-law. They have to, they get put on a kill list, and they have to flee their house.
And Daniel, at one point, Tricia Raffensperger texts Kelly Loeffler.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
that is quite a text.
I don't remember. You remember the exact words of the text?
No,
we should get it out.
Find it.
We can find it, but basically saying, do you realize what you're doing to my family?
Yeah.
Do you? And it all came out later on, a few months ago publicly, but do you realize what you're doing to my family, that what toll this is taking? And if I recall correctly, she never responded.
She did not respond.
Yeah.
That is true. And one of the things that's important about this is they were not just going after the sort of principals. They weren't just going after, elected office holders and, election administrators. What's really insidious and really dangerous, and I think really corrosive to democracy, is the way that they were going after the families, the children, the siblings, the parents. And if there's anything that is going to keep people from doing public service and getting into politics, it's if you're doing so can bring that kind of harm to your own family.
Here is the text that Tricia Raffensperger sent to Kelly Loeffler that night. Never did I think you were the kind of person to unleash such hate and fury on someone in political office of the same party. My family and I are being personally besieged by people threatening our lives because you didn't have the decency or good manners to come and talk to my husband with any questions you may have had. Instead, you have put us in the eye of the storm, and it goes on. You do not deserve to be in elected office. You are not worthy of that position. Good day and good night.
Oh. Good day and good night. That is one of many colorful quotes in the book. You also had some quite colorful quotes from Governor Brian Kemp, who gave Chris Carr, the Attorney General, some sage advice. Without saying exactly what it was, can you tell us a little bit about how you got that story and what happened?
Well, look, this is in a chapter we call the Republican Stone Wall, because the fact is, it was the entire top echelon of Republican office holders in Georgia who stood up to Trump and refused to do what he was demanding, and essentially thwarted his efforts in Georgia. Obviously, Raffensperger is front and center because he was the guy in the eye of the storm. But Brian Kemp, at one point, there's a question about demanding the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, has filed a lawsuit on behalf of Republican attorneys general
invalidate Georgia's vote
around the country, to invalidate Georgia's election, which was an extraordinary, it was a Hail Mary to the Supreme Court, right? And they were trying to get and they wanted Georgia to join. They wanted Chris Carr to join the lawsuit challenging the results of the election in Georgia that had just been certified. And Carr consults with Kemp, and Kemp says, you don't want to join this lawsuit? Carr says no. He said, well then, F him, right? That's the governor of Georgia. By the way, why was Kemp so willing to stand up to Trump? And, the best explanation, because, Kemp was a conservative stalwart, of the same believed in most of the things Trump was trying to do. And the best explanation that we got was his wife, Marty, was fed up with Trump, kept claiming credit for Kemp's victory over Stacey Abrams, and she was fed up with that, and she got...
They say all politics are local.
Anyway, but Carr, not only vowed to resign, rather than defend the effort to call a special session of the legislature, and Raffensperger, of course, but the real hero in all this was Raffensperger's chief of staff, Jordan Fuchs.
I was about to ask you about her.
Yes, and that is the most extraordinary
And as
story
I do,
of all.
that'll be my folks, whoever wants to ask other questions can line up, because I do want to get a question about Jordan Fuchs in, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
I mean, here's this young Republican consultant. She gets a job at the age of 28 as Raffensperger's chief of staff. She had managed his campaign for Secretary of State while she was working at Landmark Communications for Mark Roundtree. 2 years later, she's in the eye of this storm, election storm. She's 30 years old. She's there when she learns that Mark Meadows is flying down, has come down to observe the Cobb County audit, and she personally goes there to block him from going in.
Stands at the doorway.
Stands at the doorway, to block Meadows from coming in.
This is made for movie stuff right here.
It is. And then, the clock is ticking towards January 6th. They realize, the Trump people, that, they've got to get a win somewhere, and they just look... Georgia's our best shot at getting a win. We got to talk to Raffensperger. And Raffensperger had been ducking a phone call from Trump for weeks now. He didn't want to talk to Trump. I mean, Trump was suing him. Like, they were litigants, opposing litigants. But at this point, Mark Meadows calls up Jordan Fuchs, says the president really wants to talk to your boss. They decide, okay, they've got to do it. But the lawyer's got to be on the call. And Jordan Fuchs, on her own, unilaterally, without telling anybody, tapes the call. Spur of the moment decision. She wants to protect her boss. She wants to make sure, because she knows that Trump's going to distort anything that gets said in that call. And here's this young woman who did the one thing that gave us the most compelling evidence of Trump's pressure.
There almost certainly wouldn't have been a criminal investigation at all had she not done that.
That phone call is front and center in the Jack Smith case in Washington, and of course in the Fani Willis case. We say in the book it was arguably the gutsiest and most consequential act of the entire post-election battle. Nobody knew the story. Nobody knew who was responsible for giving us the words, the tape of the president, putting the kind of pressure he did on Brad Raffensperger.
And folks, don't be shy if you have any questions. But Daniel, one more about Jordan Fuchs. Someone at the Georgia Capitol who many people might not even recognize, but who played such a pivotal role. I mean, of course, I've known her for years, but a lot of lawmakers, a lot of activists, lobbyists, they might not even know who she is.
Jordan Fuchs?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the one other part of the story that Mike didn't tell is that she was in Florida visiting her grandparents when she made this spur-of-the-moment decision to tape the call. Well, Florida is a two-party consent state, which means that if you are going to tape someone on the call, you have to tell everybody on the call that you're recording it. And she obviously didn't do that and couldn't do it. And so she exposed herself to potential criminal prosecution. In fact, one of the things we learned when we were reporting this book was that the January 6th committee that was extensively investigating what happened in Georgia wanted to call Jordan Fuchs as a witness. And she would have been quite the witness. But the Secretary of State's office, one of their lawyers, intervened and asked whether, more than asked, I think they, strongly urged them not to call her because they knew that this could be a problem. And the January 6th committee agreed. In the end, she did testify before the special purpose grand jury here in Fulton County, but Fani Willis immunized her. So she would not face any criminal exposure.
I should point out there is an exemption under Florida law, the Florida taping law, for law enforcement, and the Secretary of State's office is a law enforcement agency. So she probably would have a good defense if any Florida prosecutor went after her. But still, it's, it was a gutsy thing to do, and she did it.
Sir?
Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm curious if you have a sense of how active a role DA Willis will take in the courtroom if this eventually comes to trial.
I think she was always going to take an active role in the courtroom. She is, I think there's no question that she is the most talented trial lawyer on that whole prosecution team. But I have, and I know that people on the team, because they know that about her, had been urging her to take a prominent role, opening statement, cross-examining witnesses. I have since heard from a well-placed source, since the controversy erupted, that assuming she stays on the case, that she's not disqualified, that she may take an even greater role in the trial.
That's interesting.
And that's something in fact, I just heard a couple of days ago, and that sounds very much like Fani Willis.
Thank you for the question.
Yes. Regarding the fact that Jordan Fuchs was the one who recorded the now world famous Trump-Raffensperger phone call, if Netflix decides to produce a miniseries about the Georgia trial, I guess they could they theoretically title the episode about the tape "No Fuchs Given"?
Michael, I'll let you take that one.
Yes, they might. I'll give you that.
That's good. Okay. Thank you for the question.
First of all, thanks awfully. You guys are doing the Lord's work, I think. I really do. And you could not have made clearer how high the stakes are. And you could also not have made clearer the protagonist's complex personality. And so I'm going to ask you to do something that likely you don't want to do and maybe can't do. But
I like this question already.
It's to predict the future. What you know way more than I do, and probably than anybody in the room does, about what's going to happen in the court in the next few days and what the judge is like. And this is the burning question of the moment, and everything depends upon it.
We have no idea. But I'll make a couple of observations. I was a little surprised at the Zoom hearing today that Judge McAfee agreed to have this at least a partial evidentiary hearing on Thursday and Friday, in which the witness who, Ashley Merchant, the lawyer for Michael Roman, who brought this whole issue to the court's attention, will be able to call this former law partner of Nathan Wade to contradict the sworn affidavit he has submitted about when the relationship began. We'll see what she's got. We'll see what this guy is going to say. But at the end of the day, I'm still stumped by what she could say if the judge asks the simple, pointed question, can you explain why the relationship between Fani Willis and Nathan Wade has prejudiced your client? because I can't see any evidence that it has. His constitutional rights have not been violated. There's no evidence of prejudice against Roman or any of the other particular defendants, certainly not because of an inter-office romance between two middle-aged single people. I mean, I know a thing or two about sex scandals, and as sex scandals go, this is about as lame as you get. I mean, really, what are we talking about here? They were dating, okay, I'm not quite sure why it's, has any impact on this case. So it may be that the judge, just sort of reading the newspaper and seeing the coverage and seeing how worked up people are, feels he has to go through the motions of having an evidentiary hearing so he can reach a ruling. But I could be wrong.
I mean, at the end of the
wrong,
day,
and maybe he will go further. We will see.
Yeah. At the end of the day, as much as people talk about this is a political problem, this is a terrible optics problem, the judge is going to have to ground his decision in Georgia law and in precedents, and he has to find that under Georgia law, this was a conflict of interest that somehow biased the prosecution against the defendants. And we don't really see that. I mean, the theory of the case, just very quickly, because we want to get to all the questions, is that because she hired Wade and was paying his salary, and then they went on a few trips together, that this was some kind of corrupt bargain to enrich themselves. It's pretty strained reasoning, and by that logic, anybody who's hired to be a prosecutor has an incentive to keep the case going so that they can make more money. So we don't, in the end, see that she'll be disqualified. But again, as Mike says, judges have a lot of discretion, so we don't know what's going to happen in the end.
Great question. Thank you.
Well, to get back to the question of Raffensperger as a hero and the other,
I don't think I said Raffensperger as a hero, did I?
Well, I think I heard that word.
He certainly stood up to Donald Trump.
I think I heard that word, yeah.
Right.
Anyway, I'm happy, that this all came out and that the Kemp people resisted and that they didn't find the votes. Okay, great. But of course, after that, they then proceeded to enact more repressive, voter suppression laws in Georgia. They're still doing it even as we speak. So, do you think that there's any chance that the next time, coming up soon, this sort of shenanigans occur, there will be the same kind of, moral stance in Georgia? I'm personally, as a former Georgia State employee and observing this, the legislature, I'm rather pessimistic.
Well, look, I mean, here's my take on all that, which is, obviously Republicans have fallen all over themselves, to cater to Donald Trump and not get him upset and all that. But when he asks them to do something that crosses the line, that would violate their oath, that would, violate the law, a lot of them don't. And that's what happened in Georgia. That's what happened in Arizona with the Speaker of the House. It's, really across the country, there was no, Republicans controlled the legislatures in most of those battleground states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, but none of them did his bidding when it called for calling a special session to reverse the results, the actual election results. Everybody knew that was crossing a line. So while there's no question that, Trump, a lot of what Trump says seems quite menacing, and a second term has a lot of people quite spooked for very legitimate reasons. It is worth remembering that when he asks people to cross the line, a lot of them don't, even loyal conservative Republicans who have been with him.
Very quickly, it could have gone very differently in the 2022 midterms when you had David Perdue running for governor, who said he would not have certified the election. When you had Jody Hice running for Secretary of State, the Republican race, saying he would not have certified the election. And we have a lieutenant governor who was a fake elector who still could be charged criminally as part of this overall case, just not by Fani Willis. Your question, sir?
Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it. Daniel, I hope you move to Atlanta because we can use every vote down here. It's so close. It might be even closer than 11,780 votes. And Mike, we went to high school together. Very proud of you. I have an idea. If you guys can do the sequel, you might have your 5th New York Times bestseller. and will you follow up with? You think you'll follow up? I know you can't predict.
Well, there'll be plenty to write about in the paperback. I'll say that.
In the paper? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. And we only have time for a couple more questions, so keep them short.
Okay, try to keep me. Again, thank you for everything. So you may have answered this just now in terms of saying that a lot of office holders have not crossed certain lines. And yet, in the wake of really the last 3 to 4 years of events, and particularly what happened here, are you seeing activity in specific states, I'm thinking especially battleground states, to make this sort of, you say crisis, less likely, more likely? Are Secretary of State's office or Attorney Generals taking certain precautions? I mean, maybe that's too wide open a question, but I guess what I'm saying, as we in the lead up to this election, and what might likely happen, if Trump loses and says it was fixed, yada yada, what might take place differently this year than took place in the last two election cycles?
I think actually one of the bigger things that happened is actually on the national level with the reforming the Electoral Count Act, because what was happening with the effort to overturn the election on January 6th to get Mike Pence to send the votes back to the states. They were exploiting this ambiguity in that law about what the role of the vice president really was. It's not clear in that statute, and the Constitution doesn't spell it out either. And they tightened up that language. They made it more specific. I think it would be much harder to do what they were trying to do. In terms of, legislature by legislature in the states, I think there have been some reforms. I think Pennsylvania has a Democratic governor who came in, and I think there are certain changes that he has been trying to make. I'm not exactly sure whether he succeeded. So I think it depends on the states, but I think they are working on some of those kinds of fixes as well.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, first, I want to say I really miss skullduggery, and I hope it comes back.
That was our podcast that we did for.
And this kind of grew out of the podcast, right?
Yeah.
And also, so I think these death threats are so ubiquitous and so widespread that I think it's the most corrosive thing that's happening in American politics today. And I don't see why nobody's talking about it, and that Chris Wray isn't doing something about it. And I don't know if you have any idea why nobody seems to be doing anything about it.
Some of these do get investigated, but they're hard to pin down because they come in anonymously. People can use burner phones, whatever. They don't leave their names. So we've come across a number of cases where they were able to trace who was making the threats, and people have been charged, but very few, and clearly not enough to have made a real impact.
And the other is the legal problem is that we have a very robust First Amendment, and when you look at these threats, they're often if it's a direct threat, we're coming to your house and we're going to kill you, that's a crime. Right, but if it's you should be hung, or sometimes these are sort of more carefully worded than you would think, and those are just very difficult to prosecute.
Thank you for the question, sir.
Yeah, congratulations, Michael and Daniel, for writing a book that's super relevant at this moment. But this is I do have a question about this moment. When you guys found, you've been working 2 years on this book, and when you find out about these revelations just weeks ago, what's your response? Is it okay, we're right in the thick of it moment, or is it an oh no moment?
I think we went through
a number of stages. Obviously, we didn't see this coming. Nobody did. I mean, as I think Daniel pointed out, I mean, even people on the election team at the DA's office weren't aware of this relationship. We'll see how it plays out. I mean, we don't think she's going to be disqualified, and if that's the case, then this will blow over to some degree, and the case will proceed.
But I mean, just to say it a little crassly, I mean, it did this play to our advantages in some ways, because we have the most full portrait of Fani Willis, who I think people are very interested in right now, as I said, I think at the beginning, the book provides an enormous amount of context and a kind of a fully rounded portrait of this person, which I think can help people make their own judgments about her.
And final quick thought, look, Georgia was the crime scene. Georgia was ground zero for everything that took place afterwards. Everybody who was involved in the events that led to January 6th, we're all here in Georgia first. Rudy Giuliani, making, ridiculous claims before the Georgia State Legislature. John Eastman, zooming in. The Proud Boys, they were all here.
We're ground zero whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Melita Easters to close us out.
Well, Georgia has a lot of many interesting characters in politics, and you've told us about some of the big ones. But who else is the most interesting character that each of you met in your interviews?
Well, I would like to mention one that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I mean, interesting is an interesting word to describe. Lynn Wood, who I think, I can tell that most of you know who Lynn Wood is. Obviously, was a very prominent trial lawyer from Atlanta, well known in the 90s for the Richard Jewell case and representing JonBenet Ramsey's family. And then, in just a few years ago, he sort of went down the QAnon rabbit hole, this kind of far right, conspiracy theory, about a global international cabal of blood drinking, child sex traffickers. And the reason that I think Lynn Wood is important is because as we reported this story, one of the things we discovered was that the QAnon conspiracy theory was a much bigger driver of the whole Stop the Steal enterprise than we had ever realized. Lynn Wood is a guy who, after the 2020 election is tweeting that Mike Pence is going to be executed by a firing squad, that Chief Justice John Roberts is involved in sex trafficking of children and pedophilia. And
with Jeffrey Epstein.
With Jeffrey Epstein, by the way. And after all of that, Don Trump Jr. Brings him into the inner sanctum of the Trump legal battle in Georgia. He becomes the face of this quixotic legal battle here. And he gives up his plantation called Tomotley in South Carolina to all of the fringiest characters from the Trump campaign who went down to South Carolina, spinning these crazy conspiracy theories, writing legal briefs that were soundly rejected by every judge that saw them, and you can think, well, this is just colorful and weird and exotic, but it's actually consequential and dangerous, because it was these people who were flooding the zone in Georgia and in many other places with these crazy conspiracy theories that that unleashed hundreds of thousands of their followers, millions of their followers, to do the same. And it's what led to so many of these horrific threats that we were speaking about before. You know, last thing I'll say about this, just very quickly, you know, we're about to go through a presidential election. In all likelihood, that's going to be between Donald Trump and Joe Biden again. And QAnon, you know, they've receded a little bit from the public imagination. The press doesn't write about them quite as much, but they are bubbling beneath the surface, and these dark forces are still there. And this election, I fear, is going to fulfill some of those prophecies, and we're going to be back in the same situation that we were in 2020, and that's dangerous.
Michael, most interesting character you met during your travels here?
Again, in the air quotes, interesting,
Yeah.
Chester Doles, right? You know,
that didn't get quite the rise that Lynn Wood does, but
yeah. Chester Doles is a former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan who spent 7 years in prison for beating up a black man, and then additional years in prison for federal firearms charges, and forms his own militia, was part of this racist skinhead group called the Hammerskins, was at Charlottesville during the, big demonstrations there that turned violent, and he became active in Georgia politics because of Donald Trump. He, campaigned for Donald Trump. He was passing out leaflets for Donald Trump. He held a rally for Donald Trump. And he goes to see Raffensperger on January 6th, by the way. Mm-hmm. Didn't get a lot of attention. He and his militia buddies went over to the Gold Dome and, the militia buddies are outside. Chester Doles goes in to confront Raffensperger with his list of grievances. The state police alert Raffensperger, and they hastily escort him out of the building. I mean, as Raffensperger told us, I didn't want to get into a bar fight with this guy. But the very idea that a guy like this would become active and a player in Georgia politics was pretty stunning. I actually met with him in, what's the name of the town?
In Cummings.
In Cummings, yeah, he wanted to meet in Cummings. And he said, and he made a reference to
County.
the historic Cummings in historic Forsyth County. Of course, did a little research, and I realized what he's referring to, which is that there was a massive case of ethnic cleansing in Forsyth County, in which they drove out all the black people after a couple of lynchings, and that's what he was, and because of that, they didn't have to have during Jim Crow era, colored and white bathrooms and water fountains, because there were no black people left in Forsyth County. But interesting, when we met, he talked about how much Trump meant to him, and how Trump, when he made the comments about, there are fine people on both sides about Charlottesville, how much it meant to him and his racist buddies to have the President of the United States basically bless what they were doing. Of course, he did also acknowledge some personal pain because he'd had 13 children, and 2 of his daughters hooked up with black men, giving him biracial grandchildren, which he had a real hard time dealing with.
And that'll be more in the sequel.
Yeah.
Folks,
right.
give a giant round of applause to Daniel Klaidman, Mike Isikoff, and they're around to sign your books if you haven't bought them already. They'll be around to say hi as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so very much for coming this evening. We will here personalizing those books for you, and we'll make a lovely, neat, organized line straight across the front here at the stairs. Have a safe trip home. We'll see you all again very, very soon.